Welcome to today's event. I'm Amanda Anderson, the director of the Kogut Institute for the Humanities, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Sarah Schulman, who's joining us for the third event in our series, Democracy, a Humanities Perspective. As a novelist, playwright, nonfiction writer, screenwriter, activist, and AIDS historian, Sarah Schulman has produced an amazing body of work over the past decades. Her 20th book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, was published this year by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and will be the subject of her talk today. Based on nearly 200 interviews with ACT UP members, the book is an extraordinary entry into the complexities of a powerful, distinctive, and historically important movement. It builds on her longstanding work in collaboration with Jim Hubbard on an oral history of ACT UP. Her talk today will be about her book, Let the Record Show, and in particular, the lessons that today's activists can draw from the practices and experiences of ACT UP. Given the acute challenges faced by those trying to engage in effective action in today's political landscape, I'm sure this will be an important talk and conversation. We encouraged attendees to spend some time viewing the film United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, which was directed by Jim Hubbard and produced by Jim Hubbard and Sarah Schulman. It has been shown widely since its premiere in 2012 and has garnered several awards. If you have not yet had time to watch it, I hope today's talk will inspire you to watch the film and read Sarah's book. Another book that I think members of this audience may be particularly interested in exploring is Sarah's 2016 book, Conflict is Not Abuse, which carries the subtitle, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair. Conflict is Not Abuse brilliantly works between political and psychological registers to probe dynamics of scapegoating and punishment that haunt many of our collective and political processes, our group dynamics. It has only become more relevant in the years since its publication, and I strongly recommend it. It is a sensitive, balanced treatment of the way trauma and its aftermath can inflect political processes and social dynamics. I encountered it first when teaching a collaborative humanities course on anger in politics and literature with my colleague, the political theorist Bonnie Honig, and in the context of our teaching the film, United in Anger. A few brief words about the format for this afternoon's event. Sarah will give a short talk, after which we will move directly to a conversation and then open it up to an audience Q&A. So please be thinking about questions you would like to ask, and you can add them to the Q&A at any time, and the earlier you add them, the more likely it will be that we will get to yours. And we will get to as many audience questions as possible. So without further ado, we will now turn to Sarah, whom I want to warmly welcome to Brown and to the Kogut Institute.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm here from a very humid New York City and I wish I was there in person. So just to begin, we now know that AIDS has probably existed for about 100 years, and it probably came to the United States around 1940. It certainly came to New York in the 60s and 70s. But science did not recognize the pattern until 1981. And the first public announcement of this was an article in the New York Times in July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco. Now let me translate that title for you in its 1981 context. So in 1981, gay people were a profoundly oppressed minority in this country. Gay sex was illegal. In fact, sodomy laws were not federally overturned until 2003. In New York City, where my book takes place, there was no gay rights law. So you could be fired from a job or kicked out of an apartment. You could be denied public accommodation, that means restaurant service or hotel. And familial homophobia was the cultural norm and quite virulent. Also, street violence against gay people, which was known as gay bashing, was practically a form of entertainment, and there was no one to turn to for protection. So this was a period of great oppression into which this medical emergency was introduced. But even more so, because the homophobia of the era was so strong, there were a lot of people theorizing the causes of homosexuality. And you only try to find out the cause of something if it's a problem. Like no one is running around trying to understand why people like sports, for example. But there was a kind of an obsession with the cause of homosexuality. And now we know that sexuality is different in each person and that it can change over a lifetime. But at the time, it wasn't thought of that way. It was on a binary that there was heterosexuality and homosexuality, which was one thing. And many of the theories were that it was biological. In fact, there was a pseudoscience that claimed that homosexuality was caused by your hypothalamus gland or all kinds of these bizarre behaviors. So, theories. So that when the New York Times said 41 cases of rare cancer found in homosexuals, one of the first thoughts was that it was the biological disease of homosexuality itself that was being manifested in this new illness. And so actually the first name for this disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. So that shows you where we started. Now, in the first 5 years of the AIDS crisis, the government did absolutely nothing, and the pharmaceutical industry did nothing. They had tried to recycle some failed cancer drugs that they own the patents for. And what they were hoping for was to find a drug where it was like a pill and you would take it and it would make your AIDS go away. But the disease didn't really function that way. The reason they were looking for one medication to address all of AIDS was because that was the largest market share. But the way people with AIDS experience the disease, well, first, let me explain that AIDS is like an umbrella term. It's kind of like cancer. It's different in each person. But what it means is that your immune system is no longer working. And so people would develop these symptoms as their immune systems collapsed. And these were called opportunistic infections. And it was very common for very young people to become blind or demented, to develop skin cancer, to get to a place where they could not process nutrition and would waste away, where the nerves on their legs would swell and they couldn't walk. And AIDS death was a terrible death and people really suffered. So people with AIDS wanted treatments for the opportunistic infections, but pharma was not going that way because those were very small market shares at the time. The first 5 years, 40,000 people died of AIDS in the United States. To date, we think it's about 700,000 in this country. And what the gay community did was try to sort of create some kind of facsimile in those first 5 years of social services. So for example, Gay Men's Health Crisis had a buddy system that was invented by a Puerto Rican gay social worker named Diego Lopez, where people would volunteer to be a buddy and they'd be assigned to a person with AIDS who probably was going to die. And because of familial homophobia, many people were abandoned. And so this buddy system would become sometimes someone's only companion or somebody who could help them do their shopping or something like that. There was an organization that would walk your dog. There was a group called God's Love, We Deliver that would bring home-cooked meals to homebound people with AIDS. But the political response really didn't start until 86 and 87, when the Supreme Court upheld the sodomy law in the decision Bowers versus Hardwick. And you have to understand what a slap in the face that was. People were in the middle of a mass death experience, surrounded by death, facing their own suffering. And here the Supreme Court comes along and says, oh yeah, gay sex, sodomy should still be illegal. People were so angry that this political response erupted, and there were very angry demonstrations in the streets of New York and in Washington, D.C., demonstrations without permits, so that meant that they were civil disobedience. And there were a few little expressions of politics, political organizing that emerged right before ACT UP was founded in March of 1987. One was a graphics collective of gay men that made a poster with an upside down pink triangle, which was the sign of gay men being incarcerated in concentration camps by German fascists, and against a black background, and underneath it said silence equals death. And they put this poster up all over the city. And then there was a ZAP action group called the Lavender Hill Mob. Now, a zap action was a tactic that came from the gay liberation movement. And when you do a zap, it means that you're pretty alienated from power because it's usually about bursting in and screwing everything up. So they dressed up in concentration camp uniforms, notice dual Holocaust references, and burst in on a meeting of the CDC. But it wasn't until March of 1987 when the writer Larry Kramer gave a talk at the Lesbian and Gay Center in New York City, and the people in the audience decided that they wanted to start a new group. And a few days later, they started a group and they came up with the name ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. In the next 6 years, which are the years that I cover in my book, 1987 to 1993, ACT UP had remarkable victories. And I want to tell you what some of them were so that you can see what its impact was. So ACT UP forced the pharmaceutical industry, and this is working within the larger AIDS activist movement, to change the way they did and organize their research. ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to make experimental drugs available to people who needed them, even if they had not been approved. ACT UP, in a 4-year campaign, forced Social Security and the CDC to change the definition of AIDS so that women with AIDS could qualify for benefits and experimental treatment, because women had symptoms that men did not have. And so those symptoms were not on the list. And so women could actually die of AIDS and never qualify for a diagnosis, which meant they couldn't get benefits. And women with AIDS tended to be poorer, and more of them were women of color, and those benefits were essential to people's lives. Also, and I'm going to explain this, women were not allowed in experimental drug trials. I know this sounds crazy, but what happened was in the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and many of them had children that were born without limbs. And there were big lawsuits against pharma, and they had to pay out millions of dollars in settlements. So they said, okay, no more women in experimental drug trials. Well, when there's no treatments, experimental drug trials are the only available treatments. So women really had to fight to get into those trials. And this victory, in some ways, is ACT UP's most far-reaching victory, because today, every woman with HIV around the world who takes the standard of care medication is taking a drug that was tested on women. So that had a very long reach. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City. ACT UP stopped the Catholic Church from obstructing condom distribution in the public schools. And this was before the pre-sex scandal. This was at a time when the Catholic Church was incredibly powerful in New York. The cardinal was sometimes more powerful than the mayor and was in office longer. So ACT UP, standing up to the Catholic Church in December of 1989 by disrupting Mass to protest the Catholic Church policies that were going to cause people's deaths, was very, very bold and a real turning point for the movement. ACT UP also got HIV removed as a pre-existing condition for private insurance, which made insurance now available to 600,000 people with HIV who were not eligible before. So, and I think that really the biggest change, even with all those incredible victories, is that ACT UP transformed the way that people with AIDS and queer people thought about ourselves and the ways that we were seen by the world. Prior to ACT UP, the only representations of people with AIDS in the mainstream media were emaciated, helpless people lying in beds dying. And after ACT UP, and particularly after ACT UP took on the Catholic Church, the image in the media changed to people fighting for their lives. And this was a dramatic, dramatic change. So I want to share with you just a little bit about how they did this, because I think that, you know, there are some lessons to be learned, or at least to think about, for today's activists. And it's very, very difficult to get access to activist history, usually because how a movement works is something that actually no one in it even really understands, since it's a collection of all the little parts put together into a big machine, but also because mainstream media grossly misrepresented ACT UP and how it functioned. So to understand, for us to understand, me and my collaborator, Jim Hubbard, we conducted 188 long-form interviews over 18 years with members of ACT UP New York. And what we found out right at the beginning was that we were just like everyone else in ACT UP. We thought that what we did and our friends did was ACT UP. And everyone thought that, and no one had the institutional overview. So we started to amass exactly what had happened, the order that it had happened, and what the strategies were. And I want to share with you some of the basic strategies. So one of the things that I think is really important to know is that ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. And by that I mean people did not have to agree. Now, you may think that that's unwieldy, but let me tell you a little bit more about how that worked. There was a bottom line. There was a statement of unity, which is like a statement of shared values. And that was only one line. It was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that's direct action as opposed to social service provision. So basically, if you were going to do direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. Now, people would argue, and this was pre-gentrification New York. It was like very Jewish, Italian, Puerto Rican, kind of like people would argue. But in the end, if you wanted to do something and I didn't want to do it, I would not stop you from doing it. I would not insist that we all agree. I just wouldn't do it if I didn't agree with it. And I would go find my people to do what I wanted to do. And I'll give you an example. So at that time, one of the main ways that AIDS was spread in New York was by drug users, IV drug users sharing needles. People didn't want to share needles. They just didn't have access to clean needles. And there was a movement to try to make needle exchange legal in New York. But this was a brand new idea because it was based in this idea called harm reduction. Now we understand harm reduction as like a mature, humane, complex approach to life in a way. But these were other times, and the basic idea in circulation about how to deal with drug addiction was abstinence. It was abstinence or nothing. At that point, there was a Black mayor in New York, David Dinkins, and the Black community was very ambivalent about this new idea of harm reduction. So, and many people in ACT UP didn't understand it either. And so when current and former drug users inside ACT UP started to work on needle exchange, there were people in the organization who didn't agree with it. And they argued with them, but they didn't stop them from doing it. They just didn't do it. They went off and did the things that they wanted to do. And what this created was that it was a kind of radical democracy that allowed people in the movement to be effective from where they were at. And like one of the hardest things in life to accept is that people can only be where they're at. And we all want people to be where we're at, but they're not. They are where they are at. So if you have radical democracy in a movement with, of course, a bottom line of values, direct action to end the AIDS crisis, you're facilitating a wide range of people acting in an effective way that makes sense to them. And so as a consequence, ACT UP had so many campaigns going on in so many different milieu, in so many different ways, with so many different aesthetics, that actually it was that sort of simultaneity of response that made it so effective. And I think historically, when you look at movements that have tried to force people to all hold one analysis or all do one strategy or all agree on one strategy, I think those movements always fail. And I have yet to find an exception. So what this radical democracy creates is big tent politics, where people who are very different but share one thing can work together without trying to change each other. And this is something that I think is very beneficial for us today, because so many different communities in the United States are under attack right now. Most people in this country cannot live the lives that they want to live, but there's so many differences between us that if we can develop a kind of big tent politics where we can get along with or cooperate with people based on how we agree with them, instead of trying to make them agree with us, I think we'll go a lot farther. Now, ACT UP was predominantly a white gay male organization, but there was significant participation by women and people of color. And interestingly, because of when it happened, the women and the people of color tended to have more political experience because they had come from previous movements. Now, the older gay men had been in gay liberation, but the younger gay men, for the most part, had never been politically active, whereas the women, like me, came from the feminist movement. So we had a lot of experience with reproductive rights movement, with the feminist women's health movement, with the women's peace movement. Also, there was a large participation by Latinos in ACT UP. And this was a time when there were fascist dictatorships in Chile and Argentina, and a lot of people were in exile who had been in student movements or had been in the student movement in Mexico City, and they came with politics. And the fact that we all came in more politically sophisticated was welcomed for the first time because people in ACT UP were desperate and they needed to be effective. And when people need to be effective, they're a lot more open than when they feel like they have time to waste. And ACT UP did not have time to waste. So that's sort of, was the structure, and very important strategies came from these earlier movements. For example, the feminist women's health movement had a politics that was patient-centered because the medical establishment at that time was all male. So in order to find out what women needed in an activist health movement, they had to look at everything from a woman's point of view. And very particular women who had been in that movement, like Maxine Wolf or Marianne Bonsoff or Risa Denenberg, came to ACT UP and brought this idea of patient-centered politics. And that became the politics of ACT UP, that people with AIDS are the experts. And we should listen to people with AIDS and look at things from their perspective and not from the perspective of science. Another movement was the feminist peace movement. And people like Jamie Bauer, who had been in that movement and were very sophisticated about civil disobedience and civil disobedience training, brought that experience in. And for many people in ACT UP, nonviolent civil disobedience was a transformative experience. And many people got arrested. One of the lawyers I interviewed, Lori Cohen, said that she herself processed 10,000 arrests. So getting arrested peacefully was a big part of ACT UP's protest. So there was this, but when you're in a minority, when there's a few women or there's a few people of color, there's always going to be sexism and racism. It's never not going to be. And the question is, how do you deal with that in a way where it doesn't eat up all your energy and you can still keep your eyes on the prize? And interestingly, women and people of color in ACT UP never stopped the action to try to demand like consciousness raising on racism or sexism. Because the truth is, you can spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail. Instead, they very brilliantly marshaled the ample resources of the majority white men of the group for their constituencies. So for example, when the Latino caucus saw that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico really needed support, and they decided to go to Puerto Rico to help start ACT UP Puerto Rico, which they did do, they just went to the fundraising committee and asked for the money, and they got it. ACT UP had done an art auction, had raised $650,000, and we did not have to raise money for our constituencies. When women with HIV needed to travel to testify or to go to demonstrations, or they needed to stay in hotels, that money came from fundraising. The women didn't have to raise that money. So in this very smart way, I think women and people of color were able to constantly move forward for their constituencies by marshaling these resources. So those are just some basic things that I think are very, very helpful for us to think about. And I just want to take a few more minutes to talk about where these ideas came from. Because, no political movement is discrete. Every political movement is influenced by movements before in lots of different ways. The gay movement is sometimes seen as its own thing because other left-wing movements did not want gay people. The Communist Party kicked out homosexuals. The Black Civil Rights Movement famously sidelined Bayard Rustin when he was found to be gay. The feminist movement had a number of lesbian purges. So there was an autonomous queer movement, but really because other people didn't want us. That's why we were there. However, there were people in our movement who had been in previous movements, sometimes in the closet, but had experiences. But there was another way that we were influenced, and I want to end with that because I think it's really fascinating. So I was born in the 50s. Most people in ACT UP were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there was no concept of like a gay child. That didn't exist yet, even though we were. So as these kind of alienated queer children with no one to identify with and no image of any kind of gay community or anything like that, we saw Black resistance on television in the 1960s. We saw Black people standing up to the police. We saw Black people in the pages of Life magazine or the pages of Jet magazine, or some of our families were involved. We saw Black people doing nonviolent civil disobedience, but also doing direct action, like sitting in at segregated lunch counters. And we really internalize this. Because later, when I was researching my book, I reread Dr. Martin Luther King's 1964 essay, Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he famously lays out his concept of direct action. And what's fascinating is it's exactly ACT UP's concept of direct action, even though we never said it and we never studied it and we never discussed it, but we had clearly internalized this influence. And so let me just lay out for you what that view is, and then I'd be happy to have questions. So the first thing is that you have to be the expert on your issue. And that the reason for that is that you don't want to be in an infantilized relationship to power where you're begging the powers that be to solve the problem. They don't know how to solve it and they don't want to solve it. So you have to create the solution. And in order to create the solution, you have to become the expert. You create a solution that is reasonable, winnable, and doable. You present the solution to the powers that be. When they refuse, you do what Dr. King called self-purification, or ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training. And you prepare yourself for nonviolent but theatrical civil disobedience that will communicate through the media to the public what your issues are and your reasonable solution. And this is the way that you bring pressure onto the powers that be. And, that's what's called a campaign. So just like having a demonstration for no purpose, I mean, it can get your anger out, but when you do an action or you do a demonstration, you want it to be linked to a demand, a reasonable demand that you have designed and that you are presenting. And so that way, all of your actions feed each other and build to something productive. And that's what a campaign is. And that's how you organize. So thank you very much. That's a very brief summary of a 750-page book, but I hope I conveyed some points that are relevant to you. And I'm very open to hearing your questions and thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. We already have a few questions coming into the Q&A, which is wonderful. I think I'll start myself with just a couple of questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. One of the things that you stressed in the very last thing that you said was the importance of bringing your campaign to the media. And one of the things that's so striking in the book, particularly some of the actions, like the action at the FDA, for example, was they're so savvy about how to engage the media, at that time, the mainstream media. And you also note that not only was ACT UP really canny about how to approach and engage the mainstream media, but they created their own media importantly as well, prominently, say, for example, Outweek. So here's a question I have about sort of like maybe the difference between the media landscape then and the media landscape now. So today's media landscape is vastly different. And the biggest difference has to do with the prevalence of social media and some of the ways in which social media affects political processes, particularly via stoking divisiveness, misinformation, and forms of anger, as we were reminded forcibly in the testimony of the Facebook whistleblower this month. So I was just sort of wondering how you think social media affects the ability to adapt the tactics of ACT UP, which were formed under such a different set of conditions.
Well, I don't think any technology is inherently good or bad, and that things can be used to benefit people's lives or to hurt people. And each generation has the challenge of finding a creative relationship to the corporate social media that they are presented with, whether it's a telephone, right, or a television set, or whether it's the entire internet, to find a way to move yourself forward. And there are certain advantages. ACT UP was a pre-internet movement. We did not have email. We did not have YouTube. And there's certain advantages to that technology, but there's really nothing that beats in real life. Because when you spend time with real people in real life, you start to understand what their lives are like in a very deep way. And you can start to come up together with ideas for solutions that are creative, that address each other's experiences that you might not have been aware of before. But I also want to say that there's other changes in the media as well. And one is that in the 1980s, the media was almost entirely white and male. I mean, even as a white lesbian myself, there was absolutely no one like me in any public position. You know, there was no Rachel Maddow or anything like that. And now, you know, people are doing projects that are really revolutionary in the mainstream media and putting out very radical ideas and being rewarded for them and getting MacArthur grants and Pulitzer Prizes and all this kind of thing. And so certain kinds of radical ideas are circulating in a way that they couldn't before. Now, so are reactionary ideas. It's all very elevated, you know. But one of the advantages today is this cadre of young radical people of color in Congress. And we never had people like that in the government. You know, the government was something that was so far away from us. And some of these people are really great, and they're able to move ideas around. And that's exciting that there's people for us to partner with that we didn't have before. So, you know, we're really in a time when things are different all the way around, and there's a heightened exposure for everybody. And we haven't figured out how to make that work to our benefit, but we just have to keep trying to not be controlled by it, but to figure out a way that we can have some control over it.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And yeah, it's so interesting watching the film, getting the sense of how important those embodied meetings every Monday night were. But I think all of your points are extraordinarily helpful. I'll ask another question. One of the most visible and vibrant forms of social protest recently has been the movement for Black Lives. Do ACT UP and Black Lives Matter have things in common that we can learn from, be inspired by, or alternately, are there differences that might be made instructive as well? And are there other contemporary movements that you think are worth thinking about in relation to ACT UP?
Well, there's a lot of exciting movements out there right now. You know, the movement for Black Lives, the movement against police violence, the movement for refugee rights. Housing is the national crisis. Nobody in this country has adequate access to housing. You know, and then there's movements like Palestine Solidarity, which is one of the strongest movements on campuses around this country. I think Students for Justice in Palestine is one of the largest political campus groups in the United States. The trick is for these movements to relate to each other. And, you know, it's hard to say have in common. I mean, gay people at the time were on the outside. We were illegal and we didn't have legal rights, but because there were some people in that community who were elite, we also had certain kinds of access. There were people in ACT UP who had gone to Ivy League schools, who had been stockbrokers and who had worked in media and things like that. And then the vast majority of us who did not. 1/3 of ACT UP members did not have health insurance. So it was a very, very broad class range. And Black people in this country don't have access to that kind of wealth. So that's a very big difference. But one thing to keep in mind is don't believe what you see on the media. I think that these national movements actually have local expressions. There are local organizers in every city in this country who are working for Black lives and against police violence. And they're doing it differently based on what community they're in. And we don't have national information about who they are and what they're doing. So they're there. And, you know, so always be aware that whatever you see on television, including MSNBC, is not the whole story.
Yeah, one of the things that's really striking at the end of United in Anger is just watching that stream of all the local chapters of ACT UP, you know, and also just thinking when reading your book that you're talking about ACT UP New York, and there's so much more. Okay, that we have so many audience questions, so I'm going to move to that, and I may ask another one of mine later if the opportunity arises. So first question from Shelby Mack. Your book is the most amazing book I have read this year and one of the most amazing books I have ever read, exclamation point. I've been asking all my friends to read it. One question I have is about the relationship between social services and direct action and the co-optation of social services / care by the state. I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between social services / care provision in and outside of the state and direct action movements.
Okay, so I think there's two differences. One is a person's character. Certain kinds of people are better for activism and other kinds of people are better for social services. So it does kind of divide naturally in a certain way. But the problem is that in this country, we do not have a coherent healthcare system. So once you get into a corrupt and underfunded system, there's only so much you can do. And what activists do is that they create the existence of new policy, but they're not involved in the implementation of it, because that's where things always get watered down. So it's a pressure from the street on the bureaucracy. The dangerous thing that did happen to the AIDS activist movement is it got co-opted by the Democratic Party. And then when all the funding came in and people became social service providers, well, once you're funded, then you want to keep your funding. And then you have to meet job descriptions, and then you have to fill out grants, and they have to like you to continue your money. So interestingly, ACT UP always self-identified as a political movement, not a not-for-profit. And in the years that I covered, they did not apply for a 501c3. They did not apply for grants. They raised money from the community, first by making t-shirts and later by having an art auction. So, you know, if you can keep your financial independence, and if a community loves you, they will give you money no matter how poor that community is. That is something that I've learned over the years. If you're doing your job, your community will fund you. But once you start applying for money, you're not an activist movement anymore.
Wonderful. So the next question is from an anonymous attendee. The question is, what implications do you think the lessons learned from ACT UP might have for the climate movement today? And I will say that I was thinking a little bit about that when reading the book, and the way that the question that the audience member has asked kind of occurred to me was that one of the things you stress so powerfully is that ACT UP was a life and death movement. I mean, that the stakes were life and death. And I was thinking about somewhat more mediated challenges, like, even though it's feeling more and more like a kind of an immediate threat of certainly like serious harm, and it's now more of a climate emergency than, you know, a climate change issue. But I was just wondering about that myself. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
You know, there's elements of climate change that are out of our hands in some ways, because things are so evolved. However, what is always in our hands is our local experiences. So we've seen people who have been defending their local water, who have been stopping pipelines. We're seeing local battles for clean water. And so communities who have a need that's right there and that's real and material, and who can design solutions and then advocate for those solutions through campaigns, those are the communities that are more likely to make progress. It's very important for movements to have successes. It's really important for your demands to be winnable and doable. If your demand is, I want, you know, income equality in the whole world, I want that too, but you're probably not going to get it, and you're going to get very frustrated, because movements succeed if they make the lives better of the people who are in them. If you're only in a movement out of some kind of guilt or burden, you're not going to stay. But when you can really see your ideas being applied, and that's one of the things about ACT UP that was so wonderful and that bonds us all, even as we're now in our 60s and 70s, is that we succeeded in some ways. We also failed in some significant ways. But to have this experience with people who had no rights, and to know that we actually changed certain things, there's nothing like that. It's a very, very, very satisfying.
Well, I think the next question, also from an anonymous attendee, follows directly on this. You describe affinity groups so vividly as a critical part of ACT UP's unique structure and function. Could you say more about what it was like to be part of one?
Okay, let me just say that I personally was never in an affinity group, but I've interviewed a lot of people who were. So ACT UP had two structures. There was like an above ground official structure, which was, there was a Monday night meeting at the Lesbian and Gay Center. It had from about 300 to 700 people. There were committees that people were in. There was a coordinating committee, and people would vote on ideas and debate ideas. But there was a whole shadow structure because we knew we were infiltrated by the police. And in fact, in my book, at the end of my book, I reproduce data from the FBI and the New York Police Department that show yes, in fact, we were infiltrated and there were informants. And at the time, I personally didn't think it was true. I thought people were paranoid, but it turns out that it was true. So the shadow structure was that people formed affinity groups, which were like 15 to 20 people who wanted to do a project together or who agreed on one approach to something. They would meet at people's homes and they would plan actions that were often illegal. And they would not bring them to the floor for discussion because they didn't want to alert the police. But ACT UP trusted, there was very little control in ACT UP and there was a lot of trust. So ACT UP would give these affinity groups free legal services without having approved their actions. And many of these groups did wonderful actions, and many of them became care groups later when people died. And in fact, one of the most famous groups in affinity groups in ACT UP was called the Marys. And the novelist Michael Cunningham was a member of the Marys. And in 1993, 3 members of the Marys all died within a 10-week period. And each one of them had known that he was going to die and asked for a political funeral. And so the Marys carried out public funerals of carrying their friends' bodies. The one man, Tim Bailey, who was the menswear designer for Patricia Field, he wanted his body dumped on the White House lawn. And they actually brought his body in a van to Washington. But because of informants, the police knew they were coming and were waiting for him there. So that was unsuccessful. But the body of John Greenberg was brought to Tompkins Square Park with open casket in the park, and we had the funeral there. So, you know, this was all done by an affinity group that had bonded when they had burst into Dan Rather's Evening News to protest the Gulf War, and then years later organized each other's funerals.
Thank you. The next question is from Jalisha Jolie. Thank you for bringing the other pandemic back into our national conversations. Can you share the role and relationship of Black women and Black queer communities in ACT UP and the broader HIV movement?
Okay.
Also, there's one little more part. Also, the impact of ACT UP was far-reaching and had transnational resonances. Can you share what kind of transnational partnerships and/or solidarities evolved from this work?
Okay, so let me just first say that almost every woman in ACT UP who was HIV positive is dead now. And women with AIDS died much faster and much younger because they tended to be poorer, they were diagnosed later, they couldn't get treated appropriately because of the lack of a definition. And that was the situation. But there was some significant leaders whose faces and names you can see if you look in United in Anger, History of ACT UP. So one of the most important leaders was Katrina Haslip, who was a straight woman. She was a Muslim. She had been incarcerated at Bedford Hills Prison for pickpocketing. And she found out she was HIV positive when she got to the prison. Now, this was a prison where 2 members of the Weather Underground, Judy Clark and Kathy Boudin, were also incarcerated. And it was a quite politicized prisoner base. Now, at first, people with AIDS in Bedford Hills Prison were treated very badly by other prisoners. Prisoners were afraid of them. They set people's cells on fire. They beat people up. And so Katrina realized that there needed to be an educational program within the prison. And she and Kathy and Judy and other prisoners co-founded ACE, AIDS Counseling and Education. And they became prison advocates and amazing organizing. And when she got out of prison, she started ACE Out, which was for women with AIDS when they got out of prison. And people came from Bedford Hills right to ACT UP as well. So there was a number of women who came from Bedford who were organizers. There was Marina Alvarez. Their names are in my book. And in the film, you can see Phyllis Sharp, who was another one of the leaders of the Women with HIV movement. You see her giving speeches at 2 important rallies, demonstrations that ACT UP held in Washington, DC. And her name was on the lawsuit as well because she suffered from symptoms that were not on the list of official symptoms for diagnosis. Another person was Iris Dela Cruz, who was known as Iris with the Virus. She was a member of PONY, Prostitutes of New York. She wrote a column for the People with AIDS newsletter, and she's in our film as also a leader of the Women with HIV movement, and she died at 38. And there are many other people as well. In terms of transnational, there were 148 ACT UP chapters around the world. But the thing about ACT UP is that there was very little coordination between chapters, and people had very different situations depending on what city and what country they lived in. And people just organized the way that made sense to them. But one of the things that's interesting is, so when ACT UP was first founded, there was still apartheid in South Africa. And an exile from apartheid, a South African named Mark Visser, was a member of ACT UP. And after apartheid was officially suspended, he returned to ACT UP in South Africa. And so in those days, you transmitted information by actually traveling and speaking to people, since there was not an internet. And he brought many of those tactics with him there. And that was true for a lot of people. There would always be people in the meetings who came from other cities or other countries. But this is still true today. ACT UP London is an organization of primarily immigrants, HIV positive immigrants. And I did an event with them 2 years ago. I'm doing another one in a few weeks. And there were people from Moravia, from Tanzania, people with AIDS from all over the world who are living in London and who are activists on their own behalf.
So the next question is from Bonnie Honig, and I'll just read it. Your point about bringing a demand struck me because it's so different from Occupy's decision to refuse to make a demand, lest they be bought off or co-opted into negotiation somehow. What do you make of the move of refusal like that? And is that what you're criticizing?
No, I'm not criticizing that at all. I think that if you look at American history, you can see that there are two strands of radicalism, and one is utopian and one is reformist. And from the beginning of the colonial period, you can see that. So, there were utopian socialists, there were anarchists in the 1920s, there were hippies, but then there were reformists who wanted the end of slavery or women's vote or making abortion legal, or AIDS activists, people who wanted concrete policy changes. And I think that the society moves forward the most when both are active and are dialogic with each other. So when you have Black power and civil rights, when you have gay liberation and gay rights, when you have these kinds of movements talking to each other and creating space for each other, that's when we make the most progress. Because the further to the left is, the more room the center has. And when the left moves to the center moves to the right. So even though you may not agree, or you may agree with the most radical movements of your day, they create more legitimacy for people who want to do concrete policy change.
Thank you. And here's a COVID question. Do you see any contemporary organizing around COVID using similar strategies as ACT UP? And how do you think about the role that Fauci played in the AIDS crisis versus the role he's been playing in COVID?
Okay, huge questions. Well, it's the right wing that's doing the grassroots organizing around COVID right now, right? So I do see those tactics, but on the other side. In terms of comparing COVID to AIDS, I think that there are big similarities and big differences. And the similarities are that whenever there's a cataclysm in this country, it reveals the fissures of the society. And like AIDS, COVID just revealed racism and economic inequality. And in the way that when the drugs are developed, the fact that pharma's greed is keeping the vaccine from being distributed globally is the exact same situation that happened with AIDS drugs. And the fact that that hasn't changed at all is amazing. It just shows you that we don't really need national health, we need global health care where every person in the world has access to the standard of care. One of the big differences between COVID and AIDS is that COVID is a collective public experience that's discussed openly in the media, at the dinner table, and all of that. AIDS was like our private nightmare. Our fight was to get it into the public. And that's a very, very different kind of experience. Oh, okay. Fauci.
Yeah, Fauci.
Yes. So Fauci's the same man, it's the same guy, he's been in power all these years. So ACT UP was a coalition of very different kinds of constituencies, and those constituencies had different power and different levels of access, and Fauci treated them differently. So like the most elite white guys who had come from elite backgrounds, he related to them very well and he communicated with them very well. But for example, the women, it took 2 years before they could get a meeting with Fauci. And the men did not intervene to help the women. When I say the women, it wasn't just women, it was the people, men and women fighting for women with HIV. The men who had the access did not intervene to help them get access. And by the time they finally met with Fauci, he didn't have anything to tell them because he didn't know anything about women anyway. The drug users had even a worse trouble with Fauci. When Richard Elovich, one of the leaders of Needle Exchange, asked him why drug users were not being allowed into experimental drug trials, Fauci said, because they're not compliant. And Richard was like, you cannot write off an entire class of people, because the slogan of the Needle Exchange Committee was dead addicts cannot recover. And that is true. And that was a fight. So he was very hierarchical in terms of who he responded to.
Thank you. Another question from an anonymous attendee. Thanks so much for the talk and for, in general, your fabulous work. I appreciate what you say about radical democracy and not necessarily operating by consensus, but rather letting different groups doing different things, even if others disagree. Yet how might we think about this today in light of various very fraught differences, such as between some versions of feminist activism and some versions of trans activism? What can we learn from how ACT UP dealt with sexism and racism?
Well, those are two different questions.
Right.
So, like I said, I think you have to know, each of us has to know what our bottom line is and what our values are. Like, for example, I am a friend of Palestine and I support the BDS movement. I'm on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace, and that's my bottom line. And I'm not going to violate the boycott or anything like that. So I have my own limit for myself, and that's how I operate. And we all need to know what our bottom line values are. And I certainly support trans people, and I always have, and I always will. And that's a bottom line value. So we have to make those decisions for ourselves. And then we have to position ourselves in relationship to other people based on who we think we can cooperate with and who we share some other point of view with. And you can have decisions that you don't want to work with certain kinds of people or whatever, but we need a system that's flexible enough that everyone can respond in a way that makes sense to who they are. And then people do evolve, because nothing evolves you more than experiences with other people. Maxine Wolf was one of the leaders of ACT UP. She always said, it's better to go action first instead of theory first. Because if you go action first, your theory will emerge. Because once you decide on your action, you have to make decisions. And in order to make those decisions, you have to cohere your values. And when you have to cohere your values, you get more consciousness about what's possible. So the more active you are and the more you're negotiating with people and being flexible and figuring out where you belong, the more you will evolve.
So I have a sort of a follow-up question to this. It's sort of about identity politics, and there's a moment in the book, and you actually you discussed it briefly in the talk, where you say that once issues relevant to women and/or people of color with AIDS were articulated, women and/or people of color ACT UP members did not waste their time trying to teach their white male comrades to be less sexist and racist. And I'm just wondering, do you think that contemporary movements are misdirecting too much energy into consciousness raising or teacherly approaches to identity? It seems sort of implied in that moment in the book, and I'm just kind of wondering.
I'm not really looking at it from the institutional point of view. I'm looking at it from the individual's point of view. Mm-hmm. You don't want to you can exhaust yourself trying to persuade people to not be sexist and racist, right? And you have to keep your eye on the prize. What is your goal? What is the concrete thing that you're trying to accomplish for your community, and what is the best way to do it? And people can drive you crazy, and you can just sometimes ignore them and sometimes take them on. But it shouldn't just be this knee-jerk thing where all your energy is about trying to control what other people say. All your energy should be focused on winning what you need for your constituency. And if people are in your way, then you can do what you need to do. But it's about priorities and action first.
No, I really appreciate that. I have one more question from Bonnie Honig. The Reagan administration refusal to do anything in response to AIDS seems eerily consonant with the refusal of the Trump administration to do anything about COVID. I always thought the Reagan refusal was just homophobia, and it was, but then Trump did the same, and I wonder what is to be learned from that comparison.
Rich people don't care, and they shouldn't be in power.
One thing I really just have to applaud you for, Sarah, is the economy of your answers. But just throughout, it's wonderful because we never get through the questions, and we had a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask, this is another audience question, and I deliberately saved it for last because we are coming to the end of our time here. This is from Bill Jesdale. And could you perhaps tell a quick anecdote about our Brown alum, Stephen Gendon, who was a prominent ACT UP New York member and a founder of ACT UP Rhode Island?
Yes, and there's a picture of him in my book as well. One of the things that he was involved in was the direct marketing of AIDS drugs to AIDS patients. In the olden days, now we watch TV and there's Viagra ads and all of that, but drugs were never marketed to patients. They were only marketed to doctors, and it gave doctors all the power. AIDS patients were a new kind of patient who knew more about their disease than their doctors did. And so companies started niche marketing directly to AIDS patients. And Sean Strube and Stephen and some other people were founders of things like the magazine Pause, or direct ways of people to get medications, direct mail sales of medications, so that the communication between pharma and the patient was direct. And so he was an innovator of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just want to thank you for this amazing talk, and I find just so inspiring your focused attention on concrete goals, concrete action, and then also a kind of just attentiveness to how to work with other people to make that happen, which is so critical right now. So it's really just been an inspiration listening to you this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. I urge everybody to get the book. It's a wonderful book. You can read around in it. It's just incredibly rich. And also, again, I urge you to watch the movie United in Anger. It's very, it really will sort of transform your understanding of the AIDS movement and give you a sense of the lived experience of that movement.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Sarah.